Chères festivalières, chers festivaliers du Luxembourg City Film Festival, je suis Philippe Rouillet et je vous souhaite la bienvenue pour cette masterclass consacrée à un grand cinéaste auquel le festival rend hommage cette année, c'est William Friedkin, et il est avec nous en direct de Los Angeles, de sa maison de Los Angeles. Alors William Friedkin, vous le connaissez, c'est ce cinéaste qui a vraiment été au top du box-office dans les années 70, avec 2 films, avec The French Connection et avec The Exorcist, et qui a par la suite nous a totalement épatés par sa capacité à se réinventer, à réinventer son cinéma, au niveau du style, au niveau des budgets, tout en gardant cet attachement aux personnages, à la complexité des personnages et à la beauté des portraits qu'il en tire. Alors, vous savez que ce festival, il est évidemment digital, mais il est aussi physique, il est présentiel. Et la chance que vous avez, c'est que vous allez pouvoir vous ruer, avec vos masques bien sûr, dans les salles de cinéma du festival, à l'Utopia, à la Cinémathèque, pour aller voir les films de William Friedkin. Il en a choisi 5 pour vous. Donc The French Connection, The Exorcist, Sorcerer, To Live and Die in LA et Killer Joe. Donc vous avez ces 5 films sur grand écran, une expérience à ne pas manquer. Mais je m'arrête là parce que je vois que le maestro est là et donc bonjour Monsieur Friedkin. Merci beaucoup Monsieur Friedkin d'être avec nous pour cette première masterclass en ligne de l'histoire du festival du Luxembourg.
Oh, it's a pleasure to see you and I hope everything's going well with the festival.
Pour commencer, je voudrais dire que vous avez fait vos débuts à la télévision, comme d'autres réalisateurs américains, comme Franklin Schaffner, comme Sidney Lumet, comme Del Burman, comme Arthur Penn. Et j'aimerais savoir, qu'est-ce que vous avez gardé de cet apprentissage à la télévision pour vos films de cinéma?
Only one way. It made me realize that filmmaking or making a television program or anything for the theater is a collaborative medium. You don't do it by yourself. You can't do it all by yourself. Maybe Charlie Chaplin did it all by himself, but nobody else can. And the techniques are completely different. Live television is a medium unto itself that gives you nothing for cinema except the realization that it's all a collaboration. It's not like being a painter or a writer where you work alone.
Alors, vous avez beaucoup parlé de l'importance du film Citizen Kane dans votre vocation de cinéaste. Vous avez souvent dit que le film vous avait apporté beaucoup, mais quoi exactement?
Well, before I saw Citizen Kane when I was about 20 years old. And I had no idea what it was. But there was a man I knew who I respected very much. I respected his opinion about the arts and literature. And one day he just said to me offhand, there's a movie playing at the Surf Theater, which was in Chicago, on the near north side of Chicago. He said, there's a film there called Citizen Kane, and you should, it was made in 1941, and this was about 1955. And he said, you ought to see this. It's a really exceptional film. And I was not that interested in cinema then. It was movies. I would go to the movies that were mainly for young people, you know, not great cinema and nothing from abroad. I knew nothing about films from other countries. I was more interested then in playing basketball. But I went to this theater on a Saturday afternoon at noon, and I stayed through the midnight show. I was just stunned by the exceptional talent that was on display in all of its possible forms in cinema. The script, the acting, the lighting, the editing, it was something new and breathtaking to me. And I remember thinking to myself, I don't know what this is, but whatever this is, that's what I want to do. That's what I'd like to be able to do. And what keeps me going to make one film in my life that could be mentioned in the same sentence with Citizen Kane. And I haven't done that yet. So it keeps me going. But I was just amazed at the incredible virtuosity in all aspects of filmmaking. And right there in that theater, it made me want to be a filmmaker.
Alors, parmi vos tout premiers films, il y a deux adaptations de pièces de théâtre. Il y a Boy in the Band et il y a The Birthday Party d'après Harold Pinter. Est-ce que le fait de partir à partir d'un matériau qui avait déjà été mis en scène sur les planches, dans des mises en scène que vous aviez d'ailleurs déjà vues, est-ce que c'était une aide ou est-ce que c'était plus compliqué pour vous construire votre mise en scène?
No, those were just two very fine screenplays. When I saw them. And I wanted to do them because I related very much to what they were saying. I didn't want to simply adapt plays, but there have been a few plays in my life that I thought were cinematic and that I thought, where I thought the screenplay had said so much. Then there are other films that I made just from experience. And, I've made films that are based on novels occasionally. And there are many sources. But I guess every one of the plays that I did on film was something that I was drawn to as a piece of material. And I didn't want to necessarily do them on stage. I wanted the ability to explore them in a cinematic way because of the content, the subject matter. The Birthday Party by Harold Pinter is an extraordinary avant-garde piece of work that was a complete failure in its time. And it wound up being the principal work of Pinter, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature eventually. So yes, that was a great play. I was very young when I did it, perhaps too young, because I don't think I did a very good job with it. As I've reviewed it in recent years, I didn't get it. I loved it, but I really didn't achieve what I hoped to achieve. It's too slow. It moves too slow, and it's too ponderous. And the play itself is not. The film is ponderous.
Et quand Phil d'Antoni vous apporte le projet de The French Connection, qu'est-ce qui vous intéresse dans ce projet? Qu'est-ce qui fait que vous avez tout de suite, vous dites tout de suite oui et vous êtes tout de suite emballé?
I didn't accept it immediately, but he told me the story of the French Connection case, which occurred in 1961. And this was now about 1968 when he came to me with this story. And I was living in California, but I went to New York with Phil to meet the two cops, the flic. And they were Eddie Egan and Sonny Grasso. And they were really unusual guys. They were opposite sides of the coin. One was noisy and provocative, that was Egan, and the other was very contemplative and more quiet spoken and more logical and realistic, and that was Grasso. But they made an incredible team, and I decided what I would do is go around with them in their police car on all of their rounds to places where they would pick up, narcotics dealers. And in those days, they were arresting narcotics addicts, guys who were just smoking marijuana would get arrested by them and other narcotics detectives. And I went around with them and I found their dynamic, the dynamic between them and the people they dealt with in the street, an extraordinary world that few people were aware of. And it was that dynamic that made me want to do this film about them. I was less interested in the French Connection case. It was a $32 million heroin bust. But what interested me was not the case, but those two cops and that dynamic that they had.
Alors vous dites bien, vous avez découvert en étant avec eux, vous avez découvert cet univers, le métier qu'ils faisaient, ces rondes et tout ça. Et je me demande si, en fait, vous ne faites pas du cinéma aussi pour ça, pour vous immerger dans des mondes que vous ne connaissez pas et comme ça les découvrir.
Exactement. That's it. It can't be said better.
Alors, on sait que vous n'aimez pas les storyboards, mais quand même pour ce film, il y a plusieurs scènes de poursuite. Il y a la fameuse scène avec le métro et puis la voiture en dessous, mais il y a aussi des scènes de poursuite à pied. Comment on prépare des scènes comme ça sans storyboard? Vous allez sur place? Comment ça se passe très concrètement?
Yes, well, first of all, I've not made a lot of films. And the reason I haven't made a lot of films is because in order to make a film, I have to see the whole thing in my mind's eye. I have to have a sense of what I want to do in particular and specifically with every scene. So it is up here and in here somewhere. I don't storyboard because most of my films have been done on location. And I visit the locations first. I choose the locations, and then I let the locations influence the way I'm going to film a scene. And so I am open to what the location brings to what the script calls for. And I will very often never look at the script. And I don't rehearse. I don't rehearse in advance. I have conversations with the actors and with the crew, and I make very clear what I'm looking for and how. And then they have as much information about the scenes as I do, and they contribute to what I'm doing. They contribute to how we make the film. I encourage their own ideas, but I don't like to lock myself in to a storyboard that either I drew or someone else drew. I know when I go to a location what I want to achieve. I know what I want to say with the film. I know specifically what I want to say with each scene, and it then becomes a matter of if you've cast the film properly. If you have not cast the film well, it isn't going to work. The cast is so important, and the crew. Sometimes you work with someone and you're not compatible with them, and you have to make a change. That's more difficult with the cast, but if you have chosen your collaborators well, and if you've cast the movie well, it should be okay.
Et je crois que ça a été un peu compliqué avec Gene Hackman, justement, parce que vous n'aviez pas tout à fait la même perception du personnage.
Well, it wasn't a matter of perception. We had the same perception, but he didn't want to go there. Gene saw the guy he was playing as a racist. And I realized, and Gene was a very liberal guy in those days. He came from a very small town in Illinois and way outside of Chicago, and it had been a Ku Klux Klan town. So he grew up within a town that had the Ku Klux Klan, which he loathed. And so he didn't take kindly to the way the character he was playing, Eddie Egan, treated suspects and people they were questioning. He thought Egan was a racist. I knew that Egan was not a racist. That was an act that Egan put on to survive in the street. If he didn't take on that persona, he would have been killed in so many of the places that he had to patrol, and with so many of some of the worst criminals in America. And so he put on this persona of a tough guy. But he was not at heart a racist. But that's how he behaved in the street. And I sent Gene out with him and with Sonny Grasso the way I had gone out with them. But Gene did not want to go as far with that character as I did. I was fascinated by this character. I knew that what he was doing is something that he had to do to survive. And Gene just saw it as naked racism. And so at first, he didn't want to go that far. Just didn't.
Ben alors du coup, comment ça se passe quand concrètement on est comme ça, pas d'accord? Vous avez un acteur qui ne veut pas faire ce que vous avez envie qu'il fasse. Comment ça se passe? Qu'est-ce qu'on lui dit?
You have to persist. You must persist. And we had a difficult time on that film. The other thing about Gene and his childhood was in this little town was that his father had left when Gene was very young. His father left the family. And so Gene hated authority. And he told me that. And I knew that. And so I became an authority figure. He was 10 years older than me, but I was the authority figure on the film. And I used that. I treated him like an angry father, you know, and I was very harsh with Gene, and I would provoke him. I would provoke him to anger. And I think he was more angry at me than he was at the dope dealers, you know, and I had to provoke that anger. I would do it in the following manner. He would do a scene, and I didn't think it was hard enough or harsh enough. And I wouldn't just say, cut, let's try it again, whatever. I would say, hold it, stop. This is terrible. You better look for a day job, pal, because you're not making it here. I was very cruel to Gene to provoke that anger in him, which he had tried for much of his life up to that point to suppress. And I provoked anger in him right up to the point where I'm sure he wanted to hit me. And when I would get him to that point, I would roll the cameras on the scene. And so the anger was there. And he had to play off of that. He had to use that anger, which he didn't really, but he had it in himself, but it was buried and suppressed. And I opened the doors on it. There are many techniques you use with actors. I've never had to do the same thing with any other actor. But now, if you look at Gene Hackman's Academy Award speech, when he won the Academy Award for that role, he said, I want to thank Bill Friedkin, who got me through this. He pulled me through this when I wanted to quit. And in fact, he did quit the picture after the first day of shooting. The first day of shooting was the interrogation of the young black man that they chase and then they rough up to get information from him. And it wasn't working at all. It just didn't work. Gene wasn't hard or harsh enough. And I try to do one take. I don't want to do a lot of takes. I'm interested in spontaneity, not perfection. If I was doing Shakespeare or Molière, I would require perfection. Every word has to be perfect. But with the kind of films I've made, which are basically in the streets or somewhere, I want spontaneity. And so I don't like many takes, because you could do more takes, and you may get them perfect, but they're dead. They're not in reality. So that first day, we did 36 takes of that scene with the young African American. 36 takes, and none of them were any good. And the next day, I showed the rushes, the film that we shot the day before. I showed them to Gene, and he could see that they weren't any good. And he quit the picture. He quit. And his agent, who was a very brilliant woman, said to him, okay, Gene, it's all right if you quit. You own the film now. And all the money that they have in it, you'll have to pay. And all the money that they're committed to. And congratulations, you own the film, because they're going to charge you every cent. And so he came back. The terms that she laid out when he called his agent, sure you're familiar with the program Call My Agent in France. He came back and he was more malleable. He would work on a scene until I was happy with it. And it was difficult. It was not easy. It was extremely difficult, but he was great. I feel he was great in the picture, and I think after all these years that he's one of the best American actors ever in film. One of our very best. He's there with James Cagney and Humphrey Bogart and Spencer Tracy as an actor. He can do almost anything. He doesn't work now. He's retired.
Alors, avec un acteur comme ça, et aussi avec toutes les complications qu'il y avait sur le film, j'imagine que le montage n'a pas dû être facile. Vous étiez avec le monteur que vous aviez déjà sur Boy in the Band, Gerald Greenberg, mais je pense que là, le montage devait être beaucoup plus compliqué de monter French Connection que de monter Boy in the Band.
No. No, because as I told you, I had the film in my mind's eye. I knew what I wanted. Even with the chase, I would improvise all of the shots in the chase. There was no storyboard. I took it from the locations and what I could achieve with the stunt driver. But we couldn't rehearse it, and I had no permission to do it in the streets. We just went out and I said, let's shoot over here and let's see this car going from here to there. And then he cuts around this other car here, and then we would do it. And often there were accidents. Thank God nobody got hurt. Nobody was injured, but they could have been. It's only by the grace of God that people were injured or worse. And I wouldn't do that again. I would never do that again. I did a much more difficult chase scene in To Live and Die in LA, or it's called Police Fédérale Los Angeles in France. But I rehearsed that very carefully because that was more dangerous than the French Connection chase. But I found a way to do all of the shots, or most of the shots, that were not as dangerous as what we did in the French Connection. When, with me filming in the car and the stunt driver driving, and I filmed over his shoulder, he went 26 city blocks at 90 miles an hour and with no traffic control. We just had a siren on the top of the car, a police siren, you know, that you couldn't see, but you could hear. So I put that siren on, but we blew right through intersections, right through red lights for 26 blocks in Brooklyn. And thank God nobody was injured or worse.
Vous parliez de cette autre poursuite dans To Lie and Die in LA. C'était autre chose parce que là c'était une autoroute à contresens.
Yes.
Et donc là, c'était que des cascadeurs. Il n'y avait pas de vrais conducteurs.
Oh, these were all stunt people, yes. Which was not the case at French Connection. I put Hackman's car right in the middle of city traffic under an elevated track, and where the train would come out of the subway and go up to a track. And we filmed under that track for 26 blocks at 90 miles an hour, and with pedestrians, people who didn't even know what was happening. But with To Live and Die in LA, those had to be stunt drivers. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having this interview. I would either be dead or in jail, or both.
Mais on le voit, quand on voit French Connection, on le voit que c'est pas simulé, qu'il y a cette dangerosité. Et ça donne un piment inouï à cette séquence. Peut-être que c'est la séquence la plus unique de l'histoire du cinéma pour cette raison-là, de poursuite en voiture.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you. I have no way of judging these things, you know. If you had been to the first screenings of the French Connection for the people who ran 20th Century Fox, the people who financed the picture, you would have thought that it was a disaster. They didn't react at all. And I had no reaction to this film until it opened in the theaters. And I was in New York, and it opened at a theater with no fanfare. Fox didn't know what they had. They didn't think the picture was that good. They wanted to change it. And then we ran it for an audience for the first time, and the audience went crazy. And then they knew they had something, and they expanded it, and the rest is a kind of history. But I had no idea. The way I've approached the films I've made is I just do the best I can. And I don't leave a scene until it works for me. But I don't do a lot of takes. I make sure that the actors know what they're doing before each take. And very often in American cinema, you don't do that. You rehearse, and you make sure that everything that you set out to do is either written out or drawn, or you do a number of takes. I've heard of really great filmmakers who do 100 takes. I couldn't possibly do 100 takes of anything. It would take the life out of it for me. And so there are a number of great films where I can see all the work that went into them. I can see that they've been rehearsed to death and they're perfect, but they don't really come alive. Now, I don't do the kind of film that requires a lot of rehearsal. It requires that I've cast the picture properly and that the actors will be able to do when I ask them to do something, they'll be able to do it because they understand who their characters are and how we're approaching this. They don't find their characters in rehearsal. And very often I'll cast somebody like I did Roy Scheider for the French Connection, and just let him go. He knew exactly how to play that part. He was perfect. He walked into my office and I said, I didn't know him. He hadn't done anything that I'd seen. He'd done a lot of stage work. And I said, "What are you doing, Roy?" And he said, "Well, I'm doing a play off Broadway." I said, "What is it?" He said, "It's a Jean Genet play." And I said, what role do you play? And he said, "I play a cigar-smoking nun." And I said, "Interesting." I said, "Okay, you got the part." He said, "What?" I said, "Yeah, you are the guy. You are this guy." He said, "Don't you want me to read?" I said, "What for? There's nothing to read. There's no great dialogue in this picture. This is an action film." And as F. Scott Fitzgerald, the great American writer, once said, or often said, action is character. What a person does is who they are. And the way they do it is who they are. And I said, you just are this guy, and you'll be fine. I never read actors. I don't, even new actors like Scheider was. I don't read them. It's a totally different experience to read a script at a table in a comfortable air-conditioned room. It's a different experience to go out in the street and shoot it with a whole bunch of other things happening in the street. So casting becomes very important, but that's all instinctive, Philippe. You might see somebody and not think they're right for the role, and you might like someone else than I would. But I'll see somebody and see in them the characteristics that are already there for the character they're playing.
Mais j'ai l'impression que vous avez un talent particulier pour dénicher les acteurs. Parce que, vous l'avez dit, Roy Scheider avait quasiment pas fait de cinéma, la carrière de Gene Hackman n'était pas très poussée, mais sur le film suivant, Ellen Burstyn avait quasiment pas fait de cinéma. Plus tard, Willem Dafoe, c'était aussi quelqu'un qui débutait, c'était des gens qui avaient fait du théâtre, c'était vraiment des acteurs, c'était pas des débutants, mais pour le cinéma, et tout d'un coup, vous les voyez en face de vous, et vous avez su que ça serait vos personnages.
Well, thank you for that, Philippe. Yes, I have a vision of the way I can see the character. Often it has been very difficult to find someone that I feel that way about, you know, that I think is perfect for a role. And so in many of my films, I use real people, real police officers, real priests, people who are doing this work. In The French Connection, the fellow who finds the narcotics in the car, the mechanic in the police garage, was the actual police mechanic who found the drugs in the real case. His name is Irving Abrams. And I used him to play himself because he knew exactly what he had done and he just did it. You know, he did it with this car that we had. He went through it the way they did with the original car, and that's how they found the narcotics. And he was the guy who found them. So I used him to play himself, which I often do. And I always, it helps if you're doing a film like The Exorcist with priests, but these are actors portraying priests or portraying police officers or whatever. It helps the actors to be around these guys, to get the experience of what it's really like to do that job.
Alors, sur l'exorciste, vous avez quand même fait une trouvaille incroyable, qui est Linda Blair, qui est la petite fille, qui joue la petite fille possédée.
Oh, yes, there were literally thousands of girls that auditioned across the United States. They were put on tape by various casting people around this country. And whenever they would have someone on tape that they thought I should see, they would send me the tape. And there was nobody I thought was right. I reached a point where I felt we can't make the film. I will never be able to find a 12-year-old girl who would not be destroyed by this experience or be unable to perform what was called for. And so we started to audition 16-year-old girls who looked younger and 15, 14-year-old girls who looked younger. Still no one. And one day, I had an office at Warner Brothers in New York while this was going on. And one day, Linda Blair's mother brought her to my office without an appointment. She had no appointment to be there to audition. She was with an agency that recommended, I don't know, about a dozen other young girls for that part, but not Linda. Because she had never really acted. She had done some modeling of children's clothing as a young girl. But her mother, my secretary, buzzed me on an intercom, and she said, there's a woman out here named Eleanor Blair, and she's brought her daughter with her. She doesn't have an appointment, but would you see her? And I was in despair then because I felt we could not make the film the way it needed to be made. And the door opened and she walked in. I knew instantly she was the one. Before she opened her mouth, she was smiling and happy, adorable. just an adorable little girl and extremely bright, extremely smart and perceptive. And that's it. I hired her. After thousands of tapes had crossed my desk from across the United States. And so I've always felt there was a movie God, and that if you're very fortunate, the movie God will look after you or help you enormously to look after yourself. And I believe the movie God brought us Linda Blair. She had never really acted, not even school plays, but she understood this material much better than a 12-year-old should have. And without her, there's no way we could have made this film.
Alors, ce film, c'est quand même le dieu du cinéma qui vous l'a apporté, ou plutôt William Peter Blatty, c'est-à-dire l'auteur du roman, c'est lui qui vous l'a apporté en disant « j'aimerais que ce soit vous qui le mettiez en scène ». Mais c'est parce qu'il avait aimé French Connection, pourquoi il a pensé à vous?
It's a very interesting story. I believe it was the movie God because there was no reason I should have directed that film. Originally, Warner Brothers, which bought the rights from Blatty, they offered the film to Arthur Penn, Stanley Kubrick, and Mike Nichols, and a couple of other guys, not necessarily in that league, but those three men all turned it down. And I knew Blatty only in the following way. About 5 years before The Exorcist, I was asked by Blake Edwards. You remember Blake Edwards, the great film director? Breakfast at Tiffany's and 10 and so many other wonderful films. Blake Edwards wanted to produce a film of a television series that he had on American television then called Peter Gunn. It was an action series with a detective who was modeled after Cary Grant and played by an actor named Craig Stevens. He was a well-dressed, very polite, very sophisticated private detective. And Blake did not want to direct the film. He just wanted to produce it because he was directing another film at the time. And so he offered me the film of Peter Gunn. And I went to see him. I had just done, I'd just done some documentary films. I had made The Night They Raided Minsky's. I had made The Birthday Party. But Blake Edwards asked me to come and see him, and I was thrilled to do that. And I went to his office at Paramount, and it was a massive office, huge, very dark, all around the edges. There were just lights on Blake at his desk and people sitting in the shadows, literally, his associates and collaborators. And he gave me the script, and it was a Friday, and he said, read this over the weekend and come and see me on Monday. I lived in a little motel then called the Sunset Marquis. It's a very famous motel now, but it was nothing then. You know, it was like a McDonald's restaurant. And I lived there, and I took the script home and I read it, and I hated it. I thought it was terrible. And I went in on that Monday to see Blake. I loved the character of Peter Gunn. I thought it was a terrific TV show. And I went to see Blake on Monday. These same people were all sitting around the sides in darkness. And Blake used to, on the few occasions where I met with him, he would have a breakfast made for the two of us, a English muffin and hot tea with jam. And he sat down, my breakfast tray was there and Blake's, and we started to share breakfast. And he said, well, so what did you think? And I said, Blake, I can only be honest with you because I have such respect for you. This script is terrible. I couldn't do this, and I don't think that you should. I don't think you should do this script, Blake. And he, if that doesn't get picked up, I'll pick it up. Okay, I'll unplug it. But I said, Blake, your worst enemy would not have written this script for Peter Gunn. And he stood up. He stood up, and Blake was a black belt karate expert. And he stood up over me. He said, what the hell do you know? He said, you're just a kid. You haven't done anything. He said, you're telling me this script is no good? I said, I'm sorry. Yeah, it doesn't work for me. Maybe it's great, and I don't know it, but there's no way I could do this. And it would have been a big break for me to do it. So I left. As I'm leaving his office at Paramount and heading for the parking lot, a guy comes running after me. Mr. Friedkin, Mr. Friedkin. I turn around, and this guy comes up to me, and he says, Mr. Friedkin, I'm William Peter Blatty. I was just in that meeting. He said, I wrote that script. And he said, I have to tell you, I agree with you. He said, I totally agree with you. He said, the script needs a lot of work, and Blake doesn't want to do the work. He just wants to get the film made, get paid as a producer, and direct his other film that he wants to do. And he said, I think you're right. He said, but I've never seen anyone do that. He said, you just talked yourself out of a job. And and he said, with a great filmmaker. And he said, I really admire what you did in there, even though I'm sorry you feel that way, but I do agree with you. The script is not good. And that was it. We didn't really see each other except occasionally at the racetrack. We both like to go to the racetrack, and I'd see him there, but nothing professionally for 5 years. And then 5 years later, I'm on the road for the French Connection doing publicity. I went across America, and I went from New York City, and I started in Los Angeles, then I went to New York, and then worked my way back to San Francisco, where I must have done hundreds of interviews. And before I left, I received an envelope, a package from William Peter Blatty. And I said, who? Oh, yes, that's that guy that wrote that terrible script, that Peter Gunn script that was awful. And so I just took the package and threw it in my suitcase. And I didn't open the package. And I flew back across the country. And finally, I got to San Francisco. And I had a beautiful hotel room, a massive hotel with a view of the Golden Gate Bridge, and the San Francisco Bay. And it was one of the most beautiful cities in America. And I'm sitting there, and I finished my interviews at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and I was going to have dinner with some people at 8. But I was packing my suitcase, and I see this envelope. I picked up the envelope, ripped it open, and I sat down in an easy chair, and I started to read the manuscript of The Exorcist. And I was stunned. I sat down to read it at 5 o'clock. I canceled my dinner plans and just stayed there while it got dark outside. And I read the entire novel, and it was stunning. And it terrified me, as the film has terrified, and the novel have terrified many people for the last almost 50 years. And Blatty's address and phone number was on the envelope, was in a note in the envelope. And I called him the next day. And I said, he was living in California as well, but I was in San Francisco. I called him. I said, Bill, what in the hell is this? And he told me that it was based on an actual case that occurred when he was a student at Georgetown University, went to college there, and he had been trying to write this for many years, and he finally got it written, and it was just about to come out. And he said, and I'm going to make a film out of it. I'm going to produce the film, and I'd love to have you direct it. Would you be interested in directing it? And I said, absolutely. And I saw the whole film in my mind's eye, as I've told you. And I said, absolutely. And he then had to go out and convince Warner Brothers to hire me as the director, because they wanted these other guys, all of whom turned it down, and for various interesting reasons. But Warner Brothers didn't want me to direct it. The French Connection had not come out yet, and it was just about to come out, and I was doing the publicity for it. But the head of Warner Brothers said to Bill, "Why do you want Bill Friedkin to direct this movie? This is one of the toughest imaginable things to realize." And Bill said to them, and he said it many times since, he said, Bill Friedkin is the only director I've ever worked with who didn't lie to me. And that was his motivation. And then they resisted it, and then the French Connection came out. And it was an immediate success. An immediate success because of the movie God. And so Warner Brothers, Bill called Warner Brothers one day after the film had been out for a week. And the head of Warner Brothers, Ted Ashley, and his two associates picked up the phone, and they said, Bill, is this about Bill Friedkin? And he said, yes. And they said, well, we've seen the French Connection, and now we want him more than you do. And that's how I got the picture. It's all timing and the movie God. And what if one of those great filmmakers had said, yeah, I'll do this? But they each had a reason why they didn't want to do it. Arthur Penn said, I don't want to do anything about violence anymore. I did Bonnie and Clyde and I don't want to do anything that's as violent as that, and this is. And Stanley Kubrick said, I only want to produce and direct and develop my own films. I don't want to adapt some. He then went on and did The Shining by Stephen King. And Mike Nichols said, you will never find a 12-year-old girl who'll be able to play this part. The whole thing is on the shoulders of a 12-year-old girl. And so the first phone call I got when the film was screened by the heads of Warner Brothers was from Mike Nichols. He was at that screening. And John Kelly, who was the head of production, called me and told me how great they thought the film was. And he said, here, there's someone who wants to talk to you. And it was Mike Nichols. And he got on the phone. And the first thing he said to me was, how did you do it?
Alors, comment vous avez fait ça? On se le demande toujours, nous tous qui aimons le film. Mais ce que je retiens, c'est que vous dites que quand vous avez lu le roman, il vous a terrifié. Et donc, est-ce que vous vous êtes dit, mon but, c'est que les gens soient autant terrifiés quand ils verront le film que moi quand j'ai lu le livre? Est-ce que c'était ça la démarche?
I wasn't frightened by the book so much as completely absorbed by the story and the characters. And I was obviously disturbed by some of the things that had happened, but there was a solid grounding for what had happened. This was not just some invented horror picture, slasher movie, or, serial killer picture, or something that is meant to scare you. Blatty and I never spoke about a horror film. Never. We thought we were making a film about the mystery of faith. That's what I believe The Exorcist was and is. Now, I no longer question that when people call it a horror film, because most of the people who've seen it think it's a horror film. So I don't quarrel with that, as long as they find something in it that they can relate to, that moves them. And it does scare people. I realize that. But when I saw the film, when I put it all together and ran it, maybe it's because I was so familiar with it by then, it's never frightened me. And I didn't know if it would frighten people or not. I certainly thought it would interest them. I certainly thought that a lot of people all over the world would be interested in this, whether they believed in God or not. Because this was something else. This was coming from another place. And Bill Blatty virtually invented exorcism for that novel and that movie. No one knew what an exorcist was in this country. There were and are still many exorcisms being performed in Italy and primarily in Catholic countries, but they're not publicized, and nor should they be. It's a very personal matter, and no one wants to publicize someone who may have been seriously mentally ill and had an exorcism. You don't want to publicize that. The church never has. And so that idea of it, people didn't know what an exorcist was when Blatty came out with that book, which is why the book was so successful. And they didn't realize that it was a tradition going back to the time of Christ, that Jesus was an exorcist. It's certainly in the New Testament, but it's not something that you focus on in the New Testament. There are not many miracles that Jesus performs in the New Testament. There are only a few, but that's one of them. He performed exorcisms and evidently gave the power to his disciples to be able to perform an exorcism, which is really to use a ritual that calls upon Jesus to exorcise the victim. The priest is not doing it. He's calling upon Jesus to do it. So, but when that story came out, you know, people were dumbfounded by it.
Et alors, vous avez pris le même chef opérateur, Owen Roisman, que pour French Connection, mais vous lui avez demandé de faire tout autre chose. C'est pas la même, c'est pas la même photographie.
Yeah, well, I just trusted him by then. The French Connection was his first feature film as a director of photography, and we had a good relationship. And I felt that though he was very young, he was about my age at the time, but he was really knowledgeable about the camera, and he was good to work with, you know. He was a good guy to work with. And so though they're completely different stories with completely different techniques necessary, he was able to do them both. He had much more difficulty with The Exorcist because with the French Connection, we use very few lights and a lot of natural light. And natural light, you know, is quite beautiful. And but most of the French Connection was done on it was all done on location. There were no sets. It was all locations, and so we used natural light. With The Exorcist, we had to light everything and very carefully. And we specifically did not want horror film lighting. You know, light coming from underneath and like the classic horror films, Frankenstein and Dracula and stuff. They have a particular look, the way film noir has a particular look. But we didn't want to do that. We wanted a very carefully, almost a painterly look for the French Connection, which was not the same as for The Exorcist, which was not the same as the French Connection.
Mais justement, il me semble qu'avec L'Exorciste, on a tout le paradoxe de votre cinéma, c'est-à-dire une emprise extrêmement réaliste, des personnages qui sont vraiment dans le réel, et d'ailleurs, vous l'avez dit, il y a eu une vraie histoire d'exorciste à l'origine de l'histoire, et en même temps, une extraordinaire stylisation. Vous parlez des peintres, effectivement, on peut penser à Caravage, à Rembrandt sur la manière d'éclairer les visages, et en même temps, c'est réaliste, donc réaliste et stylisé.
Well, interestingly, the films that I would have loved to have made were not this kind of film at all. My favorite films are the American musicals of the 1940s and the 1950s, but that's gone. There is no more Fred Astaire or Sid Charisse or Gene Kelly. Those people are gone. The music is gone. The popular music of America in the 40s and 50s, which led to these great musicals, finished. I mean, except on certain radio stations, you know, where you can hear classic songs and stuff. But that doesn't exist. And so the American musical doesn't exist. But the films that I see over and over and over again to this day is part of a lost culture. The Bandwagon, An American in Paris, Singing in the Rain. Those are the kind of films that I wish I had made. But they were gone by the time I became a filmmaker. Those people, that music, those composers, it was known as the Great American Songbook, finished. today the popular music of America is, rap music and hip hop. And that does not make for love stories or romantic dancing. But I would have to tell you that probably I have a number of films that I love very much. And the one I love the most is The Bandwagon with Fred Astaire and Sid Charisse. And whenever I get often invited to either a film festival or to a school, a university or somewhere where there's a cinema course, and they invite me to speak. And they want to run one of my films. And I say, please run The Bandwagon, and I'll talk about that. Let me talk about let's give the audience a pleasant experience. And then sometimes we've done that. Instead of running one of my films, they'll run The Bandwagon. And I find that today's audiences don't get it. They just don't get it. They're not attuned to it because it's not part of the popular culture today.
Mais il y a aussi que la morale de Bandwagon est proche de votre morale, c'est-à-dire que de votre morale de cinéma, c'est-à-dire que c'est un film qui est pour le show et contre les choses intellectuelles. Il faut retrouver le goût du public, le plaisir et réussir à le traduire dans l'œuvre d'art.
Yes, I hope so. But I've never been able to make a film like that, or Singing in the Rain, or American in Paris. You know, this is part of a lost culture in America. Well, to me, the entire realm of cinema that attracted me and that I loved is gone. I'm sorry. It's gone. And often I'm asked, what movie actors would you love to have worked with? They're gone. Spencer Tracy, Humphrey Bogart, James Cagney, quite apart from the musicals. Steve McQueen. I don't have an urge to work with any particular actor today of today's crop of well-known actors. I think there are many good ones. There are many good ones, but for me, the classic cinema, is sort of in repose.
Oui, mais je suis d'accord évidemment avec ça, mais ce qui est fort dans votre cinéma, c'est que vous avez mis de côté cette mélancolie pour capter l'air du temps. C'est-à-dire qu'effectivement, dans les années 70, le cinéma classique est fini. Il y a ce qu'on a appelé le Nouvel Hollywood, et des films comme French Connection ou L'Exorciste ont été des emblèmes de ça. Mais 10 ans après, quand vous faites To Live and Die in LA, c'est un film qui capte complètement l'esprit des années 80. Les couleurs sont absolument incroyables. Vous allez chercher Robbie Muller, le chef opérateur de Wim Wenders, et vous faites, il y a presque des aplats de couleurs sur le film. Vous étiez ami avec Alain Resnais, il a dû vous le dire, moi il me l'a dit, il me dit les couleurs de Live and Die in LA sont extraordinaires, je les adore, et moi aussi je les adore, elles sont complètement ancrées dans leur époque.
No, first of all, I appreciate you telling me about René's comment because I revere Alain Resnais, and he was a friend, and I think he brought something absolutely new and fresh to cinema. And he, believe it or not, his work influenced mine tremendously. Although none of my films look like any of his, Alain Resnais was a kind of genius. But although I have a certain nostalgia for the kind of American musicals that I told you about, I'm still very much in tune with the culture today. I know what's going on. And I have it as a guidepost to what went on, what did go on in terms of cinema and popular music and stuff is something that I loved. But I'm very much in touch with what it is today, which is quite different. But as I say, the popular music of today from America is not conducive to a musical, either to dance or romance or anything like that. It's just not conducive, but I'm aware of it. And I was aware that To Live and Die in LA was a kind of a different take on a film policier. And if I were to do that film today, I couldn't do it the same way. There are restrictions on the police today that were not there at the time that made those cops more interesting. Today, it's an extremely difficult job, and there's no romance to it anymore. It's probably the most difficult profession today is that of a policeman in America. I don't know if you've been following the news, but so many of the states want to defund the police departments, get rid of them. And if there's a problem somewhere, send a social worker. And I think this is insane. But there is no romance to being a cop anymore, as there is no longer any romance to being a cowboy. Before my time, the most popular films were the Westerns. There were so many Westerns being made. And there are only a few Westerns that I really loved and still watch. High Noon. It was a great movie. You've seen that, Philippe, haven't you?
Yes, many times.
High Noon I loved, and I'm now trying to think what else. Oh, Shane. I thought Shane was a great Western. Be very difficult to do a film like Shane today, with the sensibilities being what they are. And Shane is a great love story too. It's an unrequited love. But the final shootout between Alan Ladd and Jack Palance is one of the great scenes in American cinema. So I love those two films. I'm trying to think what else. There are a couple more, but they don't come to mind. I'm not a big fan of the Wild Bunch, although my close friend and the fellow who wrote Sorcerer,
William Friedkin.
he wrote the Wild Bunch. I think it's dated a bit. There's another modern Western that I think is a great classic movie. When I say modern, this film was made, I think, in the late 50s or early 60s. It's called Bad Day at Black Rock with Spencer Tracy. That's an extraordinarily great movie.
Yes.
And though it's not a Western set 100 years or so ago, it's set in that contemporary world. It's a terrific film. John Sturges directed.
Mais vous parliez de Wallen Green, qui a écrit La Horde sauvage, Wild Bunch. Pourquoi vous lui avez demandé d'écrire Sorcerer?
We were friends. We worked together in documentary. We worked for the David Walper Company and did documentary films for the ABC television network here in America. And we had the same sensibilities. We had the same likes. And one day we got to talking about the great film by H.G. Clouseau, Le Salaire de la Peur. And we both, this was some 20 years after The Wages of Fear. And we were talking about what a great film it was and how important it was in today's world, because it was about the idea that four people who were enemies had to get together and work together or die. That was the idea that triggered this. It seemed to us that that was the condition of many countries in the world today. We either have to work together or we're going to perish together. We're all going to be blown up together. The way those four men would have been blown up by loads of dynamite. And we thought we should do this for a contemporary audience. We particularly wanted it directed toward an American audience, which had not been all that familiar with Clouzot's film. Clouzot's film played as what we call an art house movie over here. But those who have seen it will never forget it. And we hadn't forgotten it. This was some 20 years later. And so then I went to France. I think I was doing promotion for The Exorcist at the time. And I met H.G. Clouzot. And I asked him if he would be offended if I did a new version of it. And he was a bit surprised. He was, he said, well, why would you want to do that? You're doing very well with kind of films that you've made. And I said, I just love the story so much. And I would only do this as a kind of tribute to you. And I dedicated the film to him on the screen. And it's sincere. And in fact, he didn't own the rights to the film. The rights were owned by the estate of Georges Arnaud, who wrote the novel. And I never met Georges Arnaud, but that's where we got the rights to do the film. I've never considered it a remake. It is not a remake. It's another version of a great story, like Hamlet. There must be millions of productions of Hamlet all over the world. They're not remakes. They're new productions of a great classic work. And that's how I viewed what we did with Sorcerer. Another version. Many people have done versions of the great American plays by Arthur Miller, Death of a Salesman, and Tennessee Williams, A Streetcar Named Desire, and many other plays. There have been hundreds of thousands, if not more, versions of those works. And they're not considered a remake unless you do something that's a frame for frame reproduction, which Sorcerer is not. It is an homage to H.G. Clouzot.
Ce que je trouve extraordinaire dans ce film, c'est qu'il est profondément lié dans son époque et il porte en lui les stigmates de son tournage, un peu comme Acquiert, La colère de Dieu de Werner Herzog ou Apocalypse Now de Coppola, qui étaient tournés à peu près à la même époque et qui ont été des tournages un peu énormes ou qui ont failli être engloutis. Les films ont failli ne pas être faits à cause de la maladie, les intempéries, les accidents. L'histoire du tournage est presque un film en soi. Et le film, aujourd'hui, tel qu'on le voit, il en garde ça dans sa peau, dans sa texture. Et l'émotion qu'il nous procure vient aussi de son tournage, me semble-t-il.
I think that's true. It's true. It was a very difficult experience. But I confess to you that when I made the film, which was right after French Connection and not right after, several years after.
Exorcist.
was my next film, I thought that, well, I was very arrogant, and I thought anything I do will be a success. I really thought that. And The Sorcerer, when it came out, was not successful. It was a miserable failure. And it's only over the years that it's acquired quite a large audience throughout the world. But I was shocked, because I thought, and I think right now, that that's the best film I've made. I feel that is the best film I ever made, and I don't think I could top it. I have to do something else. But whereas that's what I thought, it's certainly not what the audience in 1977 thought, because that was the year that Star Wars came out at the same time. And the American film, and I think probably a lot of films from other countries, are completely influenced by Star Wars. The movie business became Star Wars, and it still is. And all of these other films are just variations of Star Wars. You know, Wonder Woman, all of that stuff. Those films would not have been made without the success of Star Wars. And Star Wars came out and became almost a religious experience for the people who saw it. At the same time as Sorcerer, whose message was bleak and more realistic than a science fiction fantasy. But the audience in 1977 preferred the fantasy. And by the way, I wish I was able to do more fantastic kind of films. All of the films that I've done are realistic. And I personally don't feel that that's so difficult to accomplish. What's difficult to accomplish is The Wizard of Oz. And, well, 2001 is difficult to accomplish. It's impossible to accomplish. Because not only the great visual style, it's the sensibility of the great filmmakers who made it. But Star Wars captured everything and still has retained it, that tremendous popularity. Whether the sequels that come out are good or bad, they are beloved of the audience. For the most part, I mean, it's almost a sport now for people to say how terrible the sequels are and this and that, but there's no doubt that it was a great life-changing experience for many people.
Mais en tout cas, ce qui est beau avec l'histoire de Sorcerer, c'est que effectivement, ça a été un échec terrible, mais on était quelques-uns à trouver le film formidable tout au long de ces années. Moi, je me souviens, j'avais un DVD zone 1 qui n'était pas très bon, mais on se le passait comme ça en secret. Et puis, il y a eu la restauration et le monde entier a redécouvert le film. Peut-être que simplement, le film était en avance sur son époque. Est-ce que vous disiez sur ce goût de l'abstraction, il y a quelque chose de ça que vous avez réussi à capter dans le film, une expérience un peu mystique, toute la fin du film, avec Roy Scheider dans ce paysage lunaire, les superpositions, on obtient autre chose que quelqu'un qui conduit ce camion avec de la dynamite dedans. Ça a à voir avec l'expérience de la condition humaine.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup. I always felt that Sorcerer was about the mystery of fate. Just as The Exorcist is about the mystery of faith, Sorcerer is about the mystery of fate. The fact that we have no control over our birth or death. We have little control over anything. So much of the good and bad things that have happened in my life were completely out of my control. You know, things happen, and you know, it's there's a great German composer named Anton Webern. And Anton Webern, who is part of the 12-tone school of music with Schoenberg and Alban Berg, one day during the war, Anton Webern opened the door of his house, walked out into the street, and was shot to death by a sniper's bullet. As a young man, opens the door, goes out in the street, and gets shot in the head and dies. This is the mystery of. It seems to me that there is a cycle to life, and that we're meant to go from infancy to childhood to adulthood and hopefully beyond. But then that cycle gets interrupted without any control that we have. We have no control over how we got here or when we're going to leave here. And that's what Sorcerer is about, the mystery of fate. The fact that those guys are thrown together in this very poor village, which is giving them escape from their crimes, and they go there and they think they're safe, and they're not safe. They're still not safe. And I don't know at the end, I don't show it because I wasn't sure whether the character played by Roy Scheider should live or die. And I didn't want to make that decision. I let the audience make that decision. There are many people I've met who say, oh, he was killed by those two guys who came for him. And others who say, well, he couldn't have been killed because he was in that crowded bar with all those people and local police officers, and he was a hero. He had saved them the jobs in this village by bringing the dynamite to an oil well fire. And it seems to me that there are just so many ties to real life in that film, in that it's a mystery and we don't have control.
Je vais vous poser une dernière question parce que l'heure a tourné, il faut qu'on s'arrête. Mais justement, quand vous parlez de la fin de Sorcerer, où c'est pas résolu, la plupart de vos films ont des fins qui restent ouvertes. C'est au spectateur de choisir comment se termine la fin. Est-ce que c'est aussi la volonté de dire que c'est comme dans la vie, l'ambiguïté est dans la vie et on ne peut pas renvoyer les gens chez eux en disant « Ok, vous avez vu une histoire pendant 2 heures, tout va bien, tout s'est terminé et maintenant vous pouvez retourner dans vos vies. » Non, les choses ne sont pas réglées. Et c'est comme dans la vie, ça ne s'arrête jamais. C'est à vous de dire qu'est-ce qui va se passer. L'ambiguïté, elle est au cœur de nos vies.
Oui, c'est vrai. I don't want to tell an audience what to think about a film that I've made. I want them to decide. I realize the most important question that I can't control is whether they will like or not like the film. I can't control that. I can only make a film that I hope people would want to see, but that I would want to see. And I don't want to have to tell people what this film is about or how they should feel about these characters. I don't, there are clues, but I believe that within everyone there is good and bad. within you and me and anyone watching this and everyone in the world. There is both good and evil within us. And how we use these qualities is up to us, but they are there. And so I don't want to tell people what they should think about these characters. I leave it to them. In the same way that I enjoy a work of art by trying to think for myself what it's saying. The great example of that is the wonderful Zen garden in Kyoto. You know, it's a series of a few rocks that are placed in combed sand. Nobody knows when these rocks were placed there. Nobody knows by whom or what their purpose is or what they're saying. But I visited those Zen gardens when I was in Japan, and I went to Kyoto especially to see the old city, and I went to the Zen garden. I was thinking, what the hell is this? Why is this such a popular place, and why do people talk about the Zen garden? And there are a bunch of benches all around the garden. And so I went up to a bench. There were very few people there. I went up and sat on a bench looking down at these stones in sand. And I thought, what is strange or mystical about this? And within about 15 minutes, I was in tears. I was crying uncontrollably because it dawned on me that these stones represented the way we live our lives, separate. No matter how close we are in separate worlds, all of us. As the nations of the world are separate on different continents, you have these various continents that contain nations, and they're placed around the oceans, and they will never come together. They're separate forever. And to me, that's what the Zen garden said. It made me realize the nature of life and existence more than anything I've ever seen, because of the separateness, that no matter how much we may love somebody, we are not them. They have their own identity, and it's separate from ours. And the Zen garden is that. These handful of different size, rather medium or large rocks that are placed out there spoke to me and said, this is one of the sadnesses of life, that we are separate and will never come together. And that's unfortunately true.
En tout cas, ce sera la conclusion de cette masterclass avec cette note d'émotion. Je vous remercie infiniment d'avoir joué le jeu, d'avoir répondu à ces questions par écran interposé. Je remercie aussi notre traductrice et pour l'intensité de ces moments. Et je vous souhaite une bonne suite et de nous refaire de bons films très vite.
I'd like to thank you, Philippe. It's great to see you again. I've always been a fan of yours. And it's always been a pleasure to talk to you and to read your work, which I see occasionally, on the internet. I'm happy to be a part of the festival, and especially with you.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci à vous et au revoir.
Au revoir, à bientôt.
À bientôt. À bientôt.
Eh bien, je vous remercie de nous avoir suivis, d'avoir suivi cette masterclass et je tiens quand même à vous rappeler, avant de vous quitter, que vous avez la possibilité d'aller voir 5 films de William Friedkin au cinéma pendant le festival, à la salle de la Cinémathèque et aussi à l'Utopia. Ces 5 films, c'est The French Connection, c'est The Exorcist, c'est To Live and Die in LA, c'est Sorcerer et c'est aussi Killer Joe, son dernier film de fiction à ce jour. Voilà. Donc bon film, profitez-en, c'est le moment.